We're gonna go in the order in the program, starting with Yu-Lien Cheng, who's a first-year PhD student in sociology at the University of Southern California. We're then going to go to Alex Del Dago. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, good. Who's a PhD candidate in art and architectural history at the University of Virginia. And then we're going to go to Valerie Wallace. Is that
Vallaire.
Vallaire Wallace, pardon me, who's an assistant professor of English at Southwestern University. Because we only have three panelists, we should have plenty of time for discussion, but I did let the panelists know in advance that I'm going to be of cruel timekeeper just to make sure that everybody has the time that they need to present their work. So thank you so much for being here, and we'll start with our first panelist, Yu-Lien.
Just it's you can see your face. Hi, morning everyone. My name is Yu-Lien, and I'm a first-year PhD student at Sociology at USC. And today I'm going to present my master's thesis titled Negotiating Precarity and Polyamory, How Taiwanese Young Gay Men Do Intimacy. And when I was in Taiwan, I really enjoyed taking courses on queer theory, feminist theory, and queer ethnography. But I gradually found that in Taiwan, there's not much research on the experience of working class gay men's intimate life. So that's why I started this project. And these four books really inspired me a lot. They have really detailed and rich experiences of the everyday life of working class gay men, either in Asia, in the UK, or in the US. So these books are really great books. Yeah. And I found that these past studies on the experience of working class gay men, they tend to use a Burdousian approach to study class and how class has an impact on their intimate lives, such as the exclusion in the gay commercial spaces or the class dynamics within intimate relationships. And these kind of approach, they tend to have a kind of determinism, which is they think that class differences would inevitably harm the intimate relationship within the partners. And yeah, so that's one thing I would like to revise, which is I want to give these partners or these people more agency and to look at how they actually negotiate their everyday life and their work arrangement in relationships, but also want to be attentive to the inequality that arise in this process. And these Burdousian approach, they also tends to treat labor itself as a class status marker instead of looking at the actual labor process and how does this labor process shape people's lived experiences. So I would also like to see how the labor process itself and the work they take, how does it have an effect on their intimate relationships. So my question is, how do precarious work and precarity transform gay men's intimacy? And precarious work here refers to, we can also call it like non-standard work or non-stable work. And this kind of work is have rise drastically after post-industrialization in different like rich democracies in the world. And this work, they tend to have unstable timeline, unstable working arrangement, and would affect people's everyday life drastically. And in order to see how people negotiate their intimate life and to see how economic life was connected to their intimate life, I used the framework of Viviana Zeliger's relational work. And in this framework, Zeliger assumes that relationships have different categories and boundaries, such as strangers, dating, couples, and marriage. And within these kind of different categories, there are certain media of exchange that are deemed as legitimate, such as certain kinds of way to express one's emotion, to have sex or not, and certain kind of usage of money. Some are deemed legitimate and some are deemed not legitimate. And different usage of these media that would either create, confirm, modify, or end people's relationship. In the process, she conceptualizes as relational work. So I would use this concept to see how these actors, they either use these kind of elements to negotiate with their partners and what's the consequences of it. So my research was done in Taiwan and the fieldwork was done in 2020 to 2022, and they're in Mandarin, but I translated it into English. I volunteered at a 同志, which is a broader term of queer in Taiwan, at a 同志 non-government organization, and attend these informants' social gatherings. And these informants, they're aged between 22 to 33 with the average monthly income of $730 US dollars. And 2 of them are indigenous and 5 of them are Han Taiwanese. And the commonality between them is they're all in precarious work right now. So I'll present 3 main findings with you today. The first is that people's interpretation would reflected through their gender ideology. So the relational work, that is people's interpretation towards certain social actions. For example, when A treats B to dinner, B may have multiple interpretation to this action, and this different interpretation may either foster or to harm the relationships. And this kind of interpretation, it may be reflected through people's personal gender ideology. And there are 2 coexisting sexual role systems in Taiwan's gay men circle, and we can detect them through people's usage of certain terms or how they express themselves. The first system is the 1-0 system, the Yu-Lien system, and the second is the Ge-Di system. So the first one, it's actually a pictorial expression. The E is the penetrator and the 0 is the penetrated. So the 1-0 system, it designates role primarily through people's sexual activity, but would not attach that much gendered expectation of behavior to people. And the second system, the Ge-Di system, is namely the elder and the younger brother. The so-called elder brother, he's mostly the penetrator, and he would be deemed as having the obligation to take care of the D, either economically or emotionally. So the second system, that carries a stronger connotation of patriarchal ideology. So people have different identification would interpret certain social action differently, and they would have consequences to their relationship. So there are 2 informants here. I would like to make a contrast between them. So the first one, Cheng, he identified as a D. So he really enjoys the financial support from his girl. So whether he treats him to meal or buy him like traffic cards or to pay rent for him, he really enjoys these kind of financial support. But for Lin, he identified as a 0. So he would feel ambivalent about receiving support from his lover, and as time goes by, he would increasingly feel ashamed of it. So this is a quote from Lin. He's describing a past relationship between him and a private high school teacher who is relatively wealthy, have a house in Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan, pretty expensive. And when they were together, the other man often treats him to meal and would pay him bills. And he said that being with him was always exhausting. I feel like a kid who was always being taken care of in every way, sexually, financially, and emotionally. So sure, it's easy to just rely on him and be childlike, but that's not who I am. Growing up, I was tired of people labeling me as a poor or just a low-income kid, and splitting everything 50-50 shows me that I'm able to contribute that and we're equal. I think equality is crucial. So to him, he in his conception, he feels like a man should be self-sufficient and should not support only receive support unilaterally and should be a reciprocal relationship. But because his current financial situation cannot afford that, he always feel ashamed or feel inferior in this relationship. And for this conceptual framework is I refined a little bit more from relational work. That is, for the partners participated in relational work, they may have equal or unequal resources between them. And for the one who holds less material or symbolic resources, they may not be able to initiate the negotiation by themselves, or they may not have the ability to reject certain negotiations. So I would like to take Chen and Tsai as example. So the reason why people will like start to negotiate the form of their intimate relationship is because their adjustment to certain precarious work. So for people working in precarious work, they may not have that much enough money to support their daily life. So they may have some kind of improvisation to their work condition and want to increase their personal income. So I found there's like three strategies by the involvement, that is multi-jobbing, or working in a flexible schedule. That is, they tend to choose night shift work or really flexible schedules so that it would increase their income, or they may tend into sex work. And these adjustments, they would create certain um, difficulties or challenge to their relationship, such as if the two partners, they both work in flexible schedules, it would be really hard for them to meet each other, even though they live at the same city, because like they would have really highly flexible schedule so that they could not arrange their schedules ahead. And if this kind of situation happens, they would want to like still gain the emotional support or the sexual experience they would like to have, even though they could not gain them within the relationship. So they may start to negotiate either equally or unequally. So for this couple, Chen and Tsai, Tsai is the girl, so he has the obligation to provide economically or to provide support economically or emotionally, but because he have a lesser income and he was reported as like having less being more like irrational of using money. So in this relationship, he's in an inferior position than Chen. So Chen can just change the form of the relationship unilaterally. So at first, they were in a monogamous relationship, but as time goes by, Chen gradually changed their relationship as polyamory. But that is not based on a equal negotiation. He changed it on his own. And as time goes by, Chen even incorporated a third person, Wang, in his relationship. And yeah, so that's how things go on. But even though the thing has ended up like this, but Tsai still want to propose to Chen for so many times. And there's one time Chen complained about Tsai with me. Chen said that I really want to get married, but I'm looking for someone more stable. Even if we don't have money now, we might have a house and a car in the future, and we'd pay them off together. Having shared goals means saving up and planning life properly. But Ty, he doesn't seem to have any plans with the way he's living now. All he wants is to date, to kiss, and cuddle. It's like a teenager's relationship, not something mature. And marrying him would probably put me 100,000 in debt right away. So we can see that Chen really wants to get married, and he also uses certain items such as a house or a car to assess the partner's fiscal capability. But because Tsai cannot meet these criteria, so in the end, Chen dropped him off in the relationship. So these examples, they have some implications to us, like after the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2019 in Taiwan, because the same-sex marriage is no longer just a distant discourse of rights, it's an actual institution that people may actually use it. So this institution, they started to have some influence on people's everyday arrangement and even their imaginaries of the future. So people would become more aware of the possibility of getting married, and they would use this to imagine their future and use this imaginary to assess their current partner. So gaming now may place greater emphasis on financial capability in mate selection. And even though same-sex marriage seems to promote monogamy at an ideal level, but like the male informant in my research, they always talk to me that like, oh, I want to get married. I value monogamy, blah, blah, blah. But in practice, actually, people would do it like probably differently, or it would probably like open to negotiation. But these kind of negotiation, they're still at an individual improvisation level, but not but have not gone to a collective challenge to sexual script. So how would same-sex marriage affect people's either sexual script or their imaginary of the future is still warrant further investigation. So thank you for listening. It's awesome. Thank you.
Okay. So up next, Mr. Alex. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just like trying to find words like where you can put it in the screen. Yeah, do you know where it's at? Because it's usually okay.
So like this is so right.
Something right here.
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm using like the mouse, there's this projector, so I'm like,
You should be able to go up to slideshow, I think. Hold down the slideshow and do view show. I think that should work as an alternative.
okay.
And then
Oh, okay, there it is.
thank you.
Alrighty.
Here's mine. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Okay. I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Alex Dago. I'm a PhD candidate in art and architectural history at UVA, and I'll be delivering a presentation titled Queering the Margins of Labor, Paul Cadmus and the Erotics of Figuration. Before I begin, I just want to note that this talk includes images and descriptions of graphic violence. Paul Cadmus's The Heron Massacre presents a scene of extreme collective brutality. Bodies are piled, beaten, and exposed within a cemetery setting. Completed in 1940, the work depicts the aftermath of a real episode of labor violence, yet it does so in a highly stylized and deliberate way. Cadmus, however, was not simply a painter of social realism. By the late 1930s, he was already known for works that combined satire, classical figuration, and homoerotic imagery. Paintings such as Gilding the Acrobats in the Bath, pictured here, demonstrate his sustained interest in the male body as a site of aesthetic idealization and queer desire, drawing heavily on Renaissance and Baroque traditions. This context is essential for understanding the Heron Massacre, where similar visual strategies are applied to a scene of violence. The painting was originally commissioned by Life magazine, but ultimately rejected by its editors due to its graphic content. Importantly, Cadmus himself chose this subject and the specific moment of violence from a suggested list by the editors. He would actually visit the small mining town of Heron, Illinois, in the summer of 1939, spending over 7 days there, gathering details and ideas for the piece itself. So it's important here to understand the work, therefore, not as a neutral reconstruction, but a deliberate staging. The composition, which we see pictured here, centers on a cluster of wounded bodies sprawled across the foreground, their limbs intertwined. Some figures are partially nude, their bodies exposed and idealized even in death. At the center, a man raises a lead pipe, continuing the assault, while another victim reaches outward in a gesture that is denied. A floral cross in the foreground introduces a visual language of mourning and sacrifice, while gravestones situate the violence within a space associated with mourning and remembrance. The scene is both a massacre and a tableau, an arrangement of bodies and scenes that invites sustained looking. So the painting here refers to the actual events of the Heron Massacre that occurred in June of 1922 during a labor dispute at the local coal mine. The conflict began when the Southern Illinois Coal Company attempted to operate its mine with strikebreakers during a nationwide coal strike called for by the United Mine Workers of America. On June 21st, armed Union miners and their supporters attacked the mine, and after a local battle, approximately 50 strikebreakers and guards surrendered under the promise of safe passage out of town. However, as these strikebreakers were being marched away, they were attacked by a local angry mob of unionized workers. Over the next 24 hours, 19 strikebreakers, their superintendent, and 2 union miners would be killed in brutal fashion. Later, when union members were tried for their murders at a local court, juries would acquit them, reflecting the deep pro-union sentiment in the local community. The incident would become one of the most notorious and shocking moments of labor history, in labor violence in American history, and highlights the tensions between workers and management during the early 20th century labor movement. Cadmus focuses not on the initial conflict, but rather on its aftermath, the moment when violence becomes a spectacle. Perhaps what is most fascinating about this is that the work came from someone who had a self-reported hatred of violence and abhorred the horror of it. So in Cadmus's attempt to quote unquote expose the horrors of violence, he represents the final moments of the massacre where the bodies of the strikebreakers are laid out and on full display as they take their last breaths and their assailants hover above and look down upon them. In this talk today, I argue that Cadmus's decision to center the strikebreaker, a marginal and often invisible figure in American art and labor rhetoric, allowed him to explore questions of social exclusion, violence, and embodiment. More specifically, I suggest that the strikebreaker functions as a figure defined through action rather than purely identity, a condition that parallels early 20th century understandings of homosexuality itself. Through this alignment, Cadmus reframes the strikebreaker as a vulnerable, even sympathetic figure, rendered through the visual language of martyrdom and aestheticized masculinity. This allows us to understand how artists like Cadmus transform the spectacle of sanctioned violence against transgressive bodies into an occasion for exploring the intersections of social marginality and economic precarity in ways that exceed conventional narratives of class solidarity or labor politics. This choice becomes all the more apparent when we consider how rarely the strikebreaker appears in American visual culture of the 1930s. In many depictions of labor conflict from this period, the strikebreaker is notably absent as a visible body. In works pictured here, such as Ben Shaw's Scabbies Are Welcome, or Morris Topchevsky's Company Violence Strikebreakers, the strikebreaker is involved solely through language, but not depicted as a body. The figure remains rhetorically present, but visually absent. In both works by Shawn and Topchevsky, language substitutes for figuration. The strikebreaker appears as a text and as a warning, but not as a human figure occupying space. What remains unrepresented also is not only the body of the strikebreaker, but the act itself, the defining moment of crossing the picket line that defines the figure in the first place. This visual absence of the strikebreaker reflects in part the unstable and often contradictory social position occupied within labor history. Despite the central role strikebreaking has played in the outcomes of numerous American labor conflicts, the subject of the strikebreaker has received surprisingly little sustained scholarly attention. As the American historian Stephen Norwood observes, most major texts in labor history often omit the strikebreaker entirely from both their text and index, treating it as incidental rather than intrinsic to industrial conflict in American capitalism. I argue that strikebreaking was neither episodic nor incidental, but rather a systemic practice deeply embedded in the political economy of American capitalism. Employers would frequently recruit strikebreakers from among the most economically vulnerable populations, newly arrived immigrants, unemployed rural migrants, and Black workers barred from white-dominated unions. Strikebreakers were often rarely professional antagonists. They were often men in precarious circumstances, seeking wages themselves in moments of economic precarity. Their participation was shaped less by ideology than by necessity. This made them difficult to represent because to depict them sympathetically complicated pro-labor narratives, and to depict them as villains would obscure structural conditions. Race would intensify this difficulty. Black workers, like I said, were often excluded from unions and then condemned and considered class traitors when hired as strikebreakers. So representing this dynamic visually or artistically would have required confronting both labor exploitation and racial exclusion, something American art avoided at the time. Yet when we return to the composition of the Heron Massacre, this striking omission becomes visible. Cadmus depicts the victims as almost exclusively white. This is significant given the racialized history of strikebreaking. Rather than representing that complexity, Cadmus aligns the strikebreaker with a white idealized body, one that can be incorporated into a visual tradition drawn from European painting of the Renaissance and so forth. And in doing so, he not only makes the strikebreaker visible, but he reframes him through a tradition associated with sanctity, beauty, martyrdom, etc. This reframing is reinforced through Cadmus's use of Christian iconography. The floral cross and references to sacrificial imagery place the bodies within a visual language of martyrdom. At the same time, these bodies are not degraded. They remain intact, muscular, and carefully rendered. As art historians such as Richard Meyer have noted, Cadmus consistently aestheticizes the male body, even in scenes of violence. This produces a tension. The figures are both victims as well as objects of visual pleasure. And here, a brief comparison to Saint Sebastian is instructive. In early modern painting, Sebastian's wounded, exposed body becomes a site where suffering and beauty coexist. Cadmus draws on this same logic. His strikebreakers are subjected to violence as well, yet their bodies remain idealized, inviting a form of looking that is both empathetic and erotic. In both cases, bodies are wounded and suffering, prime representations of martyrdom, which operates visually as an elevation of the socially marginal body through its vulnerability. The violence inflicted upon them is not obscured, but made visible immediately in ways that heighten its aesthetic and emotional impact. Cadmus does not apply this visual logic of martyrdom uniformly across his work, however, and this becomes clearer and more understandable when we turn to an earlier composition. And briefly, I'll turn here to a better sense of his varying strategy when we consider his earlier work To the Lynching from 1935. Like the Heron Massacre, this drawing centers on a body also subjected to collective violence. However, the treatment of this body differs significantly. In To the Lynching, the Black figure in the center of the composition is not rendered as a passive victim or martyr. Instead, he resists and becomes active. His body is muscular and active, straining against his attackers. As the American art historian Carmenita Higginbotham suggests, he is not rendered as a passive emblem of suffering, but as a physically resistant and active figure engaged in struggle. So this distinction here is crucial because in the context of racial violence, to aestheticize the body as a martyr risks naturalizing that violence. Cadmus instead in this earlier composition emphasizes a different form of resistance. And here we can understand this further in terms of how Cadmus complicates this dynamic by his reference to including a Black figure in the background of the Heron Massacre, positioned near the hanging of a white strikebreaker's body. This inversion of racial roles does not equate the two forms of violence, but rather highlights their structural similarities, suggesting that practices of mob punishment circulate across different social contexts. Unlike To the Lynching, where the Black body is rendered as resistant and politically activated, the Black figure in the background of the Heron Massacre occupies a more ambiguous position, neither fully victim nor a clear aggressor. His presence underscores the ethical unease of the scene rather than attempting to resolve it. Cadmus's focus on this reflects the artist's careful historical research into the actual scenes at the Heron Massacre, as well as his interest in exposing the contradictions of collective violence. particularly the ways in which marginalized subjects find themselves aligned with systems of domination that do not always ultimately serve them. So in the Heron Massacre, the vulnerability of the strikebreakers are foregrounded, and their bodies are positioned as objects of contemplation rather than resistance. Cadmus does not leave these tensions unresolved. Rather, he makes a clear intervention. He reframes the strikebreaker, historically vilified within labor discourse, as a victim worthy of recognition, sympathy, and representation. Through the visual language of martyrdom and the aestheticization of the male body, he aligns the strikebreaker with a broader category of socially vulnerable figures, including those marked by sexual dissidence. It's in this sense the strikebreaker becomes a proxy through which Cadmus articulates a critique of collective violence, one that extends beyond labor conflict to encompass the dynamics of mob hostility and the persecution of queer subjects. By centering the strikebreaker, a figure defined through action rather than pure identity or occupation, and largely absent from American art of the period, Cadmus exposes a representational blind spot within both labor imagery and broader visual culture. In reframing the strikebreaker in this way, Cadmus reveals how certain bodies become available for violence, not because of what they do inherently, but because of rather what they are perceived to do or the actions through their activities. This painting ultimately insists on a simple but forceful claim that participation in a socially condemned act does not justify dehumanization or death. By staging this argument in such a grand public manner, Cadmus produces an image that is not only anti-violence and anti-mob, but one that demands recognition of shared vulnerability, one that crosses class, across identity, and other forms of social exclusion. Thank you for your time.
You are speaking. Okay. I don't want to distract.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Vallaire Wallace. I'm an assistant professor of English at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. I'll be reading about Langston Hughes' The Big C and Class Consciousness. This paper is part of a larger project that explores the intersections between Blackness, queerness, and movement. I begin this project with Langston Hughes because his sexuality is still rife for speculation, and to me, speculation invites endless possibility. If, to quote Jose Munoz, queerness is not yet here, how can we seek this unpromisable sexuality in our Black intellectual ancestors? Hughes creates such opportunities through his first autobiography, The Big C. The Big C, published in 1940, covers Hughes's life from childhood until his early 20s. Described by Arnold Rampersad as, quote, the finest first-hand account of the Harlem Renaissance in existence, end quote, the book stands as a testament to Hughes's veracity. He was a documentarian as much as he was a writer coming into his own. While the autobiography may be lauded for what it does address, what I find more interesting is what it does not. Namely, with one exception, Hughes's sexuality. His sexuality is a curious thing, one that his biographer Rampersad describes as, quote, not so much sublimated as vaporized, end quote, unaddressed, unaddressed in favor of propagating forward Black art and livelihood at a time where it was especially precarious. I argue that we can still trace threads of sensuality through the Big C despite its overall absence, extending the attentiveness to what may or may not be queer to an aspect of Hughes's life that I find quite fascinating, his time as a sailor. Hughes comes to be a sailor at a difficult time in his life, unmoored from home and not quite adjusting well to New York City. He takes to the sea, the air of the water like, quote, tonic in the lungs, end quote. Framing being a sailor as naturalistic, where sailing becomes an extension of himself, builds well with Joseph Stockinger's assertion that to spend time outdoors as a queer man allows one to, quote, deliberately flee oppressive spaces by seeking out the marginal space of the open countryside, which is privileged space for the homosexual because it marks both his ostracism and his chance to recuperate his unnatural love in nature, end quote. As Hughes recuperates in the open sea, he also relies on the company of men. His reliance on homosocial spaces, what Sedgwick would call sites of, quote, male bonding, end quote, marked by, quote, intense homophobia, fear, and hatred of homosexuality, end quote, suggests that Hughes both desires male attention and is incredibly resistant to it. Even within these sites of male bonding, defined by homophobia, there exists desire. I want to sit with these moments of homosociality occurring in the liminal space of the sea because they are both freeing and limiting for Hughes's capacity to narrate his own becoming. If autobiography is meant to be both historical document and literal account of one's life, I find the interconnectedness between homosocial spaces, which in the case of Hughes is both the ship and the shore, incredibly curious. It is a site where he actively spends time in the company of men, deliberately ignoring the desire to quote unquote look for girls, end quote, in favor of spending time with his close friend George or writing letters to his male friends such as Elaine Locke or County Cullen. I'll focus on only one moment of homosocial intimacy here, demonstrating how it constitutes desire while also allowing for Hughes to elude the quote unquote vaporized nature of his sexuality. During his time as a sailor, the crew makes their way to Lagos. When they first arrive, Hughes reflects on his time away from his friends, especially his male ones. The time away becomes an opportunity for Hughes to send letters. In the liminal, reparative space of the sea, it allows him the freedom to discuss matters he perhaps would not were he at shore. One such letter, which he sends while away at sea to his interlocutor, Elaine Locke, reads as follows. Dear friend, forgive me for the sudden and unexpected message I sent you. I'm sorry. I should have known that one couldn't begin in the middle of the term and that I wasn't ready to come anyway. But I had been reading all your letters that day, and a sudden desire came over me to come to you then, right then, to stay with you and know you. I need to know you, but I am so stupid sometimes. However, I am coming to Howard and I want to see you and talk to you about it. I am sailing again tomorrow, but you may write me in Holland. And he sends this from McKeesport. He's on the Cosmopolitan line, and this is sent from Rotterdam, Holland. And then he says, I was so pleased to get your card from Cairo. Sincerely, Langston. Now, while we can wrestle with the fact of Locke and Hughes not being able to meet because Hughes, quote unquote, wasn't ready to come anyway, let's focus more on Hughes's sudden desire. Imbuing the language of want into the letter, it immediately adds a level of sensuality. Hughes's desire to know Locke, despite countless letters where they exchange information about each other, suggests a level of intimacy otherwise unapparent in Hughes's moments of intimacy with women in the Big Sea. There is the overt intimacy of wanting to quote unquote stay with you and know you. The repetition of wanting a particular kind of knowledge about a person that can only be revealed through contact beyond the distance of letters. One strategy Hughes uses whenever he speaks, either overtly or covertly about sexuality, is his retreat. To me, his retreats into denial support Rampersad's assertion that Hughes's sexuality is vaporized, though I disagree with the idea that his sexuality is completely absent from his life. The retreat reads to me more so as a desire to want to be known as a man, first and foremost, and an intellectual above all else. Why, even in the moment he says, quote unquote, but I am so stupid sometimes, there is a calculus of refusal, Hughes's way of denying himself the opportunity to get closer with Locke. Locke, of course, was perhaps not only known as a homosexual, but exchanged several undoubtedly queer letters with folks known as gay during the Renaissance, including Claude McKay, Bruce Nugent, and County Cullen. which is to say, quote unquote, but I am so stupid sometimes, is not only a statement of refusal to pursue further intimacy, but also Hughes is acknowledging the world Locke views himself in as a Black gay man and implicitly refusing to be a part of it. I am so stupid sometimes encompasses an awareness that the possibility for further intimacy between himself and Locke is possible, and he even admits to desire for wanting it, but he denies himself the possibility. In the meantime, he still allows for contact or further contact. Quote unquote, you may write me in Holland, which opens willingness for further contact and exchange despite being pushed away by his own retreat. Hughes's refusal to actually address the skeleton in his own closet, naming his desire for Locke explicitly, shifts the paradigm of desire and difference, creating a world where homosociality exists in the epistolary. The written expression of desire and the denial of it subverts the quote unquote compulsory experience of coming out, instead creating a dynamic where homosocial bonds leave the platonic and move into the suggestive realm of the erotic. Of course, the letter as a site for homosociality is not the only factor at hand in the autobiography, regardless of what is or isn't discussed in it. There's also the negotiation of class and the ways Hughes operates both in and outside of the working class. He upholds the reality of being an impoverished sailor with several recounts of how little money he made and how his poverty made it difficult to entertain lovers, one of them being a woman named Mary who provided financially for him, at least until he felt like he was being emasculated, and then he dumped her. Hughes' fixation on finances, his attention to how little money he has compared to his lovers or his peers, suggests that even within spaces of homosociality, predicated upon male bonding, there exists a classist divide. When he met Locke in Paris, when he finally met Locke in Paris, he had been, quote, sleeping all day long to keep from eating meals, end quote, imparting a subtle commentary on class while also noting his struggles for intimacy. His abject poverty, held in tandem with the desire to know his friend intimately, adds to the tension while also revealing a crucial aspect of class differences, its inability to be bridged. Because Hughes spends most of his travels ruminating on his inability to afford things, his very existence invites speculation on the lines between a working class subjectivity and its place in sexual denial. There's a class element ascribed to who he connects to and when, especially as he engages in working class labor at sea. Due to these lack of ruminations in the autobiography about his sexuality, and Hughes's treatment of queerness as spectacle, as difference, something to be hidden, his work overall reads as a hesitant exploration of sexuality amidst travel. And a wariness about travel in general, despite needing to do so to satisfy Black internationalist survival. It's a fascinating conundrum, one that sets the stage for the rest of the players in my project, which are James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. Hughes animates a conversation about the spectrum of queer movement in the 20th century that invites questions about sexuality, travel, and difference in the face of empire. His work also makes us think about the overall concern in the early 20th century surrounding Black masculinity. Thinking through the overall concern about Black masculinity, protecting it for the sake of proof of being a man, the demonization of more feminine men or quote unquote sissies is more an indictment on the 20th century state of affairs than anything else. And again, to drive home the point that travel does not negate the systems of control that regulate one's interaction with gender or sexuality, and its non-normativity is always under control. What is important, however, is the expression of desire, the impulse of desire that can only happen away from oversight or away from your homeland. As Essex Hemphill, quote, Black sexuality is considered politically, morally, and spiritually correct only if it expresses itself in patriarchal, religious-based constructions of family, politics, art, and culture. Any variance or transgression can cause one to be burdened with shame, end quote. The burden of shame, coupled with the burden of representation, creates a situation in which to go elsewhere provides an opportunity to escape both, or at least to try to. Langston Hughes's methodology of exploring sexuality, whether in his personal material writings or his published literature, remains fascinating and worthy of critical attention. Adding to the growing body of scholarship speculating on Hughes's sexuality, while focusing explicitly on his travels, adds another dimension to thinking about this elusive man, especially in a transnational context. As work grows in thinking about Hughes as a Black internationalist figure, forging transnational connection throughout the 20th century, inquiring into his relationship to sensuality and sexuality, or lack thereof, expands our thinking about the fullness of Hughes's life, even when he denies such fullness to us as thinkers and critics. I'm grateful to add another angle to thinking about Hughes, addressing a critical methodological oversight, which is to address sexuality, or lack thereof, within the transitoriness of his travels. Thank you for listening.
All right, well, thank you, all these panelists, for sharing such amazing work. We actually have a remarkable amount of time for discussion. I kind of regret, because the papers were so interesting. I now regret having been so militant. But anyway, I'm gonna open it up to the floor for conversation, discussion, questions to the panelists, thoughts. Oh, hi.
Thank you guys. That was a great panel. Questions? So that's super interesting, right? The kind of ambiguity of this figure and the idealization of this figure and so on. I guess I was wondering, like, how much you had thought about the representation of union members as violent thugs, because these figures, there's a kind of parallel argument, right, about their idealization in like social realism or whatever, right? And here, part of the critique of violence is to see that the sort of shock of the fight and the violent expressions and so on. So how does that work in this, either with Cadmus or in other kind of representations that you're thinking of?
Okay. Thank you so much, Heather. The point about the mob violence is, in terms of the visual analysis that I focus on, is really interesting, because I focus exclusively kind of on the lead pipe wielding mob member that kind of lurches from the union mob crowd into the foreground towards the strikebreakers. And in the kind of larger chapter, I'm really interested by how little attention the mob workers actually receive. So like the strikebreakers receive such individualized, focused attention. And then as you move to the background, they become kind of like a fleshy kind of collective whole with, yes, they're individuated, but they're seen as a kind of collective unit that doesn't warrant much detail or difference. And I think interestingly too, in terms of how I was researching the work and seeing how other scholars typically attribute a self-portrait of Paul Cadmus amongst the union workers, it's really interesting how he kind of puts himself in that mix and doesn't offer much more commentary other than that. He places himself there looking down upon the strikebreakers dying in the field below him, and it's really kind of weird tension that doesn't get resolved, so to speak. He doesn't give us any more clues to why, how, or why he did that. So I think that in terms of how I was looking at the larger figure of the strikebreaker, I was really intrigued in how absent it was from American art of the period. And when I did see representations of collective unionized workers, it was the heroicized kind of martyr-like attention that the strikebreakers received in Cadmus's painting. So I think it's this really interesting inverse that is happening here. And I kind of wanted to devote as much attention as possible to the strike-breaking figure, because it seems so anomalous in the kind of larger context. As well as also kind of dealing with those like interesting questions about race as well, because of all the strikebreakers being predominantly white. There's this really rich history of Black strikebreakers and immigrant strikebreakers that are coming into the country for forms of labor and wage that they can't get from unionized work. So I think there's a really interesting conversation going on there, and it's something that I tried to kind of poke at a little bit deeper as that. Thank you.
My question also is for Alex. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the lead pipe and the significance of it, because it seems very important, the lead pipe as one of the symbols of like working class masculinity. It's a symbol of the trade, essentially, like in the way that it's connected to the history of blue collar work in America. So I'm wondering what you read this performativity of that object relational to the kind of connections between labor, violence, and erotics that you're teasing out.
Yeah. The lead pipe is the kind of like at the pinnacle center of the composition, so it draws the eye to it right away, and the hand that is holding it is almost covered up to the forearm in blood. So it's a very visually striking part of the composition that your eye immediately goes to, and because he's lunging out from the crowd of Indian workers towards the strikebreakers, it's the figure that your eye kind of captures the most because it's the one engaging in movement. And I think that was like an interesting thing for me to piece together how much of it was reality versus fiction that Cadmus was drawing upon, because the event that he's referencing is took place 18 years before he artistically represents it on the canvas. And like I said in the talk, he goes to Erin, Illinois, and tries to get the first-hand account as much as possible, despite it occurring almost 2 decades later. And for the most part, I kind of use the words like a visual tableau, because the composition isn't meant to be like photographic evidence of how the massacre took place, but rather it's like a amalgamation of all different pieces that occurred over 48 hours. So a lead pipe was used to beat the strikebreakers, that was documented. There were bodies of strikebreakers that died in the local cemetery after crawling through town, after being chased by the union workers. All of that is documented and recorded, but Cadmus is artistically taking liberties in terms of how he's placing that into the visual field. He's placing a little bit here, a little bit there. Whether any of that actually took place at that exact moment, no one knows, because there's no photographic record of the massacre. No cameras were allowed, and the local citizens were very careful not to let any local journalists come in and document it because of just how gruesome and graphic it was. So I think these like ephemera that get left behind, the lead pipe, the bodies in the field, become the things that Cadmus gravitates towards most, and kind of becomes really ripe for conversation because they're so visceral. You look at the bodies, you look at the lead pipe that's covered in blood, possibly being used to strike again, and it just helps you that feel that much more immediate to what's taking place.
Vallaire, this question is for you. So I feel like there was a sort of collective understanding in the room when you started talking about this, the countryside as a sort of side of it's very interesting that that this like a naturalization of desire, but also this sort of like free for all. How would you say that compares to the sea? Like, what's the same or different about the sea and the countryside?
I would say it's a similar sense of the sublime, right? This sort of open vastness in which you are escaping yourself, right? And for Hughes, I think that's what he intimately desired, to be a sailor and to be like very much untethered from, yes, there is something very much, natural about being like in the countryside, and that same naturalism is also extended to the sea, right? It's this very like open vastness in which he's untethered, and that to me is why like I wanted to focus on his time as a sailor. Like it's this moment where perhaps the only moment in his life in which there is some negotiation of his sexuality that comes because he's in this kind of expansive, untethered place in which he's like experiencing the sublime. Like a lot of the big sea in his time as a sailor is him like recounting about how beautiful the sea is and how blue it is and how he feels, he feels a part of something larger because he's at sea. And that to me felt like the one-to-one connection, right? Like you're in this place and you're feeling bigger than you are because of the vastness.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's space for an asexual but homoromantic reading of the work?
Yeah.
I
Like having like looked through much of his letters with people that are like explicitly, they're explicitly queer. I've seen things. I've read things. I've read letters. His letters are, there is a lot more, there is a desire for what Scott Herring would call like friendship, right? But the friendship is much more coded and much more homo-romantic, but there is never at any point this like explicit sexual desire that's expressed, right? And I'm interested in that. Like it can be read in like this coded homo-romantic way, but it never is explicit. And I find that tension really interesting. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I was likewise very interested in this idea of sort of like the geography of the sea and nature and its relation to like some of Hughes like presumed queerness. And I just like thought that was so interesting in relation to, Langston Hughes, like the way he is kind of thought as this emblem of Black urban culture in the Harlem Renaissance. And I do think that like reveals any sort of larger points about Black culture and sort of Black desire, and if it necessitates like a sublime, other geography outside of, urban spaces. And is there, any other kind of archival readings that you can find of that, of, Black presence in the outdoors as an expression of, say, queer desire or just desire as a whole?
Yeah, that's such a great question. One of the things that I've noticed in my project overall, my last, well, second to last, I have to add another chapter, but my last chapter was on Audre Lorde, and Audre Lorde has a similar like sensibility of she has like this line where she went to Switzerland with her lover, and she's in the vast open countryside, looking at mountains. And she had said something to the effect of, I needed to get out so that I could feel the sun on my bones. There's this like, there's a moment where there's this intimate connection that can only happen in the vastness of somewhere else, right? Like this like awareness of being that can only happen in these open spaces instead of, the almost claustrophilic spaces of the city or these urban sites. I think like across all of the people in my project, Baldwin, Hughes, and Lord, whenever they're in, these urban sites, they talk about how claustrophilic it is and how exhausted they get with it, which leads them to go to these spaces where there's much more vastness, and they feel they have this like sensation of the sublime, right? And I think that that's, that tension between, yes, this is what they're known for, right? This is where like part of their celebrity emerges, and yet like that's not where they find themselves.
Yeah, I'm wondering also the role that race making plays within these very sublime sites, because I'm thinking, Baldwin spent so much of his life in the Swiss Alps as well. I mean, he wrote Giovanni's Room there, another country, and it's, I forget the name of like the short story, but it's where he's talking about going to the Swiss village. Yes. Yes, and there's this experience that the Swiss individuals there had never seen a Black person. And so I'm wondering if you can speak about this sort of race making that also is happening in these sites of sublimeness, but also isolation.
Yeah. Interesting too, because another aspect of it is these are all people that are American that go to, these sites of vastness that are in Europe, and then have that dynamic in which they are recognized as Black and are isolated because of their Blackness, and yet like they are hyper visibilized because of their Blackness in their country of origin, right? And so to get to your point about how does race factor into those moments of the sublime, I think it's interesting in A Stranger in the Village because I think Baldwin is just like, oh, they've never seen another Black person, and yet here I am, you know, I'm not returning back to Paris. Like, I'm going to be here for a while, right? There's this, it's so many words. There is this, deciding to remain even though they are the only person that's there that I think I don't know, I don't really have an answer for, but I do think like that is one of the kind of, you know, juxtapositions. They go from a place in which that is all they are known for and that they're hyper visibilized for, and then they go to a place where they are the only person in that space. And are kind of negotiating race and nation in tandem with each other in those sites as well.
Yeah. Oh, Yu-Lien, I wanted to ask you a question. I just thought I thought your kind of final conceptual term was so fascinating, in terms of like the kind of proximity or possibility of gay marriage changing the present, right? And and changing the imaginary of the future, and that sort of, that's just like a really interesting framework. And I have an anecdote from being in Taiwan on doing some lectures and being asked to go to an event that was for people who were interested in eventually having kids, mostly young women. And I was there, I was traveling with my partner and my two stepkids. So they were like up on stage too, and people were asking them questions. So it was like trying to create this kind of imaginary, right? So I that was just very much resonated with me. But I guess I wanted to ask you to kind of bear down a little bit on that framework. Like, how much does that show up in your materials? This kind of sense of like, yeah, I'm gonna be in $100,000 debt if I get him, right? Like that sort of like, it's, you know, this sort of way the future planning comes now. And also, I guess, like, because in a way, I think, like, you know, marriage, kids, all that stuff, it's like this generational possibility that opens up. And that's also about lifespan. That's also about growing old, right? So, in a sense of like, I don't want to be taking money anymore from this person, or I don't want to be giving money to this person, right? Like, how does the very idea of adulthood or maturity sort of become possible through these structural kinds of changes? That was just sort of a bit of a thing that occurred to me, because that question of how to become like a man, right, is sort of on the cards there. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, for this great question. Yeah, I'm thinking about the reactions. Yeah, because the my informants, they're mostly pretty young, like during their like 22 to 33. So I have like compared the past interview data or the past the historiography of the researchers in Taiwan, such as like the people researching on lesbians or gays in the 1950s to the 1970s, to compare their imaginaries of the future to these younger generation, which like they live in the 2020 era. And I found that the people around like 1950s, 1970s, they would not deem same-sex marriage as a possible future. Yeah, and but it does not mean that they would not want to build a relationship. They still want to build a relationship with each other, but they would use different kinds of methods, or they would they would just like step by step, and they just see like how long it can goes. They would not have that kind of imaginary of we're gonna buy a house, we're gonna buy a car, and we're gonna have kids, and which school should I choose for them, blah blah blah. So same-sex marriage really changed a lot, but at around like 1990s in Taiwan, there is a huge debate around same-sex marriage within the activist circle, but not open to the general public. So around 1990s, these are the concept of same-sex marriage is still limited within the little circle in Taiwan. And it's not until like 2014 in Taiwan that same-sex marriage couples living together, even without marriage, but they can still have some kind of legal protection with each other. This kind of concept they started to being accessible to the general public, and it started to change people's mind that perhaps we can have in the future, and perhaps we would like to assess others like physical capability because we would like to be together. Yeah, so that's the process. And recently there's more debate on whether we should let same-sex couple to use assisted reproduction, and have caused competitive debate within Taiwan because certain there are like different stances between feminist groups, and some are really against the commodification of women's body, but some are really pro assisted reproduction. Yeah, so this might be the future discussion of this topic. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Yu-Lien, just to extend this, I'm curious, as you look at the economic inequalities in relationships, did you see any evidence of multilingual inequalities or the use of language, since it's such a multilingual landscape, and the use of different kinds of, I'm just curious if that came up in that space. It seems like it could.
Multilingual.
Just the various languages and the ethnic languages that are present in Taiwan, and I was just curious if that came up in working class identities, different ways of using language and those sorts of resources in an intimate relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if you're like, no, then that's a great answer.
Yeah.
But it's that.
Yeah. Thank you. And for some context of Taiwan, Taiwan is a like highly homogeneous society. Like according to government statistics, which I just looked up like a few days ago, like Taiwan is consists of like 90% of Han Taiwanese people, and among them there are like 60% of people coming from mainland China, and 40% people was like I came from mainland China around like 18th century. So in Taiwan, the dominant language is Mandarin, and all my informants they mainly use Mandarin.
Okay.
Even though there's still some like vocabulary difference between them. Yeah, but mainly the same.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Also, isn't there like extremely high college education? Like,
Yes, because like
I mean, that makes a difference in terms of like
Yeah.
class and education of
Yeah,
kids.
that
I mean, I understood that it was almost almost universal. That may be wrong, but it's high.
yes.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I don't think we're gonna have time to get into this too deeply. I was really interested in Vallaire, you as well, Alex, in the kind of methodological challenges of abundance and scarcity. Because it feels like as scholars working in queer studies, Langston Hughes is so often described as somebody who we just don't have enough information about in terms of his own sexuality, even though it's an open secret. And Paul Cadmus, it's like you cannot talk about Paul Cadmus without acknowledging how completely over the top his own representations are in terms of sexuality. And in both cases, like we kind of end up in the same place, in these queer studies spaces of saying this is a queer text, but I'm just interested in like the process of how we get there and what that what impact that has, like the maybe I'm resource focused in this conference, but the conflict between abundance and scarcity in the archive. I don't know if that's a question. I don't know that we have time for it, but it was interesting to hear these papers in conversation with one another just because it's such a pronounced difference between the two artists you're describing.
No, it's interesting because like writing on Langston has invited a lot of hedging around the open secret and like going into the archive being very, because I don't like to do this when I'm in the archive. I don't like to be like, this letter has to fit my argument exactly. Where I'm throwing it away, hypothetically. and yet that is what ended up happening. And this idea of scarcity is very much true because in my research on Hughes, he was very particular about what went to the archive and which, library got to have his archive, and being very particular about with Carl Van Vechten, like what letters he chose. So there is also this kind of question of how does the person curate the self that you are looking at, right? That with Hughes, I really saw like he's such a like doing work on him has been so interesting because he has been very cultivating, like he's been very cautious about cultivating the kind of self that he is. That, for me as someone who does work on him is frustrating.
But you chose his own words as a text to use. So I'm interesting. I get it. I totally get it.
I'll just add quickly too, like methodologically for me, like I like how Aaron contextualized Cadmus's work. It's so obviously male centric, and the body is so immediately recognizable, and it's just there for attention and conversation. So one of the things I was kind of interested in doing with the Heron Massacre and thinking about how to kind of add nuance to the kind of Cadmus literature is thinking about this idea of like homosexuality being perceived through act rather than identity, and same thing with the strikebreaker at this moment in early 20th century American history. When I kind of got into the work and was reading all about how it was kind of created right at the time of the New York World's Fair, and George Chauncey talks all about the cracking down of homosexuality when New York is putting on this World's Fair, and New York wants to present itself as cosmopolitan, clean, safe, and free from danger and risk. So, and Cadmus was experiencing that right when he's finishing the composition for the Heron Massacre. So I think I don't know, like this, a lot of the literature I'm working through in my dissertation is this idea of like act and occupation and action rather than just purely identity discourse. So I was really interested in thinking about how Cadmus perceived the strikebreaker as being heroicized through the acts they committed rather than just purely the occupation they occupied. So in the discourse I look at and the kind of ways in which the Heron Massacre was discussed, it's always justified or vilified because of what they did, not because of who they were. They were killed because they broke the strike, went in there and disobeyed Union solidarity. It wasn't because they were strikebreaker with a capital S or because they were, they occupied a specific occupation. It was just because of the act they committed. So I think it's really interesting to also think about early 20th century understandings of homosexuality in that similar vein, as one that commits an act that is perceived to be dissident or outside the norm rather than an identity category that Cadmus often himself wasn't kind of classified himself purely.
I can't tell if it's just because his visual style has become so associated with homosexuality. It's like the way that identity works here is that every man is gay. Because it's like they're all like Tom right? So it's like a universalization of gay identity. That's why how I see it. Maybe that's just from the present, but it is kind of an interesting thing. Yeah.
Well, folks, this is going to wrap up the official portion, but there's going to be so many opportunities at this conference to continue the conversation with these these amazing scholars. So let's thank all of them for Thank you so much.